In this video, we're going to talk about determining the domain and the range of functions. So when they ask you to determine the domain, they are trying to ask you to determine the values of x that are going to define a given function. So for example, in this case, you're trying to think of values that are going to define this function. Okay? Of course, in this function, we don't expect to have any value that is going to make this function to be undefined. But as you'll see in the next questions, there are going to be values of x that can make it to be undefined. In such a case, we exclude such values as not to be part of a domain. Okay, so what is the domain and the range of this function? So the domain is actually, we're trying to determine the x values that are going to make this function defined. Okay, so in this case, we don't have any limitations. Any value of x, whether negative or positive, it can still give us a result. So therefore, we can say our domain in this case can be a set of all real numbers, okay, which you can represent as from negative infinity. This is less than x, then x is less than. So this is in terms of set interval notation. The other way you can say is, you can use this, you say x is a member of real numbers. Okay, so what is the domain in this case? Alright. Now, let's say you've been told that determine the domain, the range of that function. So we are f of x being equal to x squared plus 2. So how do we now determine the range? So the range, you just have to first of all come up with an inverse function. So remember y is equal to x squared plus 2. So our goal in this case is to make now x the subject of a formula. So what you're going to have is y minus 2 being equivalent to x squared. So if you make x a subject, it's going to be the root of y minus 2. Okay, so this is now the inverse function of that. Of course, we need, in cases where they've asked you to determine the inverse function, you're supposed to present it in this form. So where there is y, you put x now. But that is not our interest in this video. So let's try now to determine the range. So the range, we're just going to look at it in the point of view just as we determine the domain. So except what we have as our function is the root of y minus 2. So are there any limitations? Is there any value that can make this function to be undefined in terms of the real numbers? Okay, so whenever you have this root of a negative number, it's undefined under real numbers. So when you're talking about functions, we're not interested in complex numbers. So we can say that all the values that are under a square root should either be equal to 0 or greater than 0. So you should say y minus 2 should either be greater than or equal to 0. That's what we want. So we are going to see that y is actually going to be greater than or equal to 2. Alright, so these are the values that we should expect to be under the square root for it to be undefined. So how do you present it now as the range? So you can therefore say your range in this case of that function is going to be, so where there is y, you can put a function itself. So we expect that all the values that we are going to have inside that function are supposed to be greater than or equal to 2. So the minimum value that you have is 2, and all the other results are supposed to be greater than 2. And that makes sense if you look at this function. So you expect that whether you put a negative or a positive number, they are all going to be to give you a positive number at that point. And so the minimum that you can have is when x is equal to 0, and that is your 2. So that makes sense. Now let's